the NBA, Alibaba, Meituan, and more on this week's China Econ Talk.
Rap music? China? What are they even saying? What is this Chinese rap music? Sounds like they're just saying ching chang chong.
My chance new girl watch made in China. We play ping pong ball made in China.
Lulu Chen is a reporter at Bloomberg based out of Hong Kong and teaches at Baptist University of Hong Kong. Lulu, welcome to China Econ Talk.
Glad to be here.
Could you first start by sharing some thoughts about just living through Hong Kong in the past 6 months, teaching young people? What has the experience been like for you?
Yeah, it's been a really interesting couple of months. I think right now the city is in a very special state of influx where some days you look out, our office is in Central, and you look out and everything's calm and peaceful, but then hours later, it could descend into chaos, and you have people rolling petrol bombs right a few minutes across from your office. And then you mentioned that I teach at Hong Kong Baptist, and the thing is, most of the students that I teach are from mainland China, so I feel like they've been thrust into a very special situation as well. Just from the feedback, a lot of students, even though they're studying journalism, they find this whole experience really shocking, and they're getting phone calls from their parents telling them to go back to China, telling them not to go out of their dormitories.
Go back to China.
Yes, to drop everything and just go back. I do see some of them being very curious about the whole situation and trying to venture out of their comfort zone. So some of them are trying to do reporting and conduct stories, actually talk to some of the protesters and find out what the situation is actually about.
What's your advice to them?
I think the situation is changing by the day. What started out as a protest demonstration fighting for democracy is changing into something much more complicated right now. You can feel that a lot of issues, including ethnicity, class, language, are being mixed into the whole issue. And so the hostility towards mainlanders is also starting to escalate. There have been incidents where reporters who are not even from China, from the U.S., go out and speak and interview people in Mandarin, and they find themselves in a very hostile situation. So my advice would actually be for the students to come across and tell the protesters first who they are, and even speak in a neutral language like English before they engage in further conversation, because right now there's a lot of mistrust going on as well. The protesters are wary of people who claim that they are reporters, especially if they speak in Mandarin.
Oh, interesting. So your day job is not covering the protests, but Chinese technology. Do you feel what do you think the impact of this Hong Kong story has been on the sort of leading Chinese tech companies on which you spend most of your time?
Well, one of the most immediate fallouts has been for Tencent, which, this is a company that has for years just tried to keep its heads down, keep quiet, not really promote any of its stances and promote itself on the global agenda, whereas in action it's very aggressive. It's buying stakes in some of the world's largest gaming companies, investing in Hollywood movies, and also instant messaging apps. And right now, I think it's finding itself in the front and center of this issue, because for years it's been trying to import U.S. technology and also content, and with that, with a China market, a vast China market, and been reaping the benefits of both markets. Right now, these two markets are at odds with each other and increasingly becoming hostile against each other. So any company that has been using this mode of business operation is finding itself in hot waters.
Yeah, it's interesting because the incentives for Tencent, they don't want to fight a fight about Hong Kong over NBA. They signed a deal because they assumed that deal would make them a lot of money, right? But it's a real interesting tension where on the one hand, these firms have to act against their short-term economic interests when there's a political line to toe.
I feel like for years, they've always thought of any global geopolitical tensions as short-term. Right now, increasingly more companies have to take a closer look and see whether this issue will die down anytime soon and adjust their long-term strategies.
What do you think that ends up meaning, sort of for Tencent like giving up on buying up the world's latest and greatest gaming firms or curtailing international expansion? How far do you think this goes?
I don't think they're going to go back and just sell all their stake in the investments that they already made. In fact, they will continue trying to leverage the IPs, the companies that they've already invested in. But right now, I think in terms of market focus, China is their home base, and they need to make sure that they dominate this market and really operate well in this market first. If you look at WeChat as an example, years ago, they tried to expand that operation globally, and it went nowhere because it had such a solid base and you could say ties too close with China to the extent that international users were wary of using this app. So I think they've always hoped that gaming was a more neutral medium. Basketball, it seemed neutral enough, but it seems that in the world we live in now, you have like two opposite extremes, and it's a very worrying trend where companies first and foremost are having to choose sides.
Yeah, it's interesting because for the NBA players, they're making so much money off China that there's a real downside to speaking out about this sort of thing. We're recording the show on Tuesday morning, Beijing time, and just a few minutes ago, LeBron came out after a press conference basically saying, Daryl Morey, he's an idiot. He really shouldn't have said anything. But had LeBron stood up and said, you know what, I'm going to make a stand on this sort of thing, that costs him, I don't know, tens, hundreds of millions of dollars over his in his children's lifetimes. But on the other hand, I think with some of the esports stuff, particularly companies that aren't that big, some of them it seems to be trying to make their name off of taking the other side of these protests. For instance, the Epic Games CEO recently came out, Epic Games of Fortnite fame recently came out saying, we're going to defend free speech in our esports and competitor and commentator community. So, the extent to which folks are already sort of like in the sort of mainland or already like having revenue that could be threatened by China really seems to be the determining factor on where folks are going to come out on this.
Well, you talk about the gaming sector. In that sense, Tencent has three large portfolio companies, and there's division among these three companies as well. Epic has been out there saying that they support freedom of speech, but look at the two other investment portfolios: Riot Games, which controls League of Legends, and Blizzard,
Sure,
which owns the Warcraft and World of Warcraft, Overwatch, and Call of Duty IPs. These are some of the biggest IPs. Tencent has been reaping the benefits of these IPs and bringing them to China, and also converting some of the titles like Call of Duty into mobile and pushing them, publishing them globally right now. And even within its own empire, there's discordance. Looking at the Chinese reaction is also very interesting because on one hand, they're criticizing Tencent for not reining in Epic Games. The comments on Weibo, some of them are outrageous, including one saying, Tencent, why are you not holding your dogs on a leash? They're biting you in your face, right? On the other hand, in the U.S., it's not getting any people are not letting them go easily as well because they're saying this is a Chinese company. They're investing in U.S. companies and trying to control freedom of speech. So that's what's really at stake here.
It's really interesting, the sort of domestic U.S. pushback on this sort of thing. For Blizzard, for instance, they came out very aggressively against a Hearthstone player who was a Hong Konger and then was saying protest lines on a live stream. But then after folks were canceling their subscriptions, like delete Uber to World of Warcraft and whatnot, they sent out another press release saying, no, in fact, we're going to give this guy his prize earnings and it's only a 6-month ban. We're not going to kick him out of like the Blizzard universe forever. So seeing the dynamic of Western consumers caring about the stances that multinationals take towards these sorts of issues, I think is really new and will be really interesting to follow as this plays out. Because as you said, Tencent owns, for some of these companies, controlling shares, some of these companies minority shares, but is clearly like a very important player in the global gaming space, which on the one hand, okay, isn't like a newspaper, but at the same time, has people with independent opinions who have platforms who can say things.
Absolutely. And I think if you think about newspapers as the 20th century medium for propaganda, information, spread of information, going into the 21st century, more and more the internet and the vehicles that operate on whether it be content or gaming, these are the things that government entities, especially in a country like China, will be paying closer attention to on a daily basis.
So, Lulu, before we jump into some of your other stories, do you have any broader advice for following Chinese technology? What do you think is different about the way you have to cover these firms versus someone working in Northern California?
Well, the Chinese tech landscape has really, essentially, all the power is concentrating towards the top two companies. And that's happened over, I'd say, the span of the last 7 years. Before that, if you looked at the first generation companies, there was Sina, there was NetEase. Even for a brief period of time, Weibo seemed to be like one of the most popular platforms in China. But ever since I would say 2012, you've seen the rising of Tencent, underpinned by its super app WeChat, and on the other hand, there's Alibaba, underpinned by its super app Taobao. Together, these two companies pretty much have invested in most of the important Chinese internet companies, and they divide the landscape. So, as a startup operating in China, there's a real question that you have to ask yourself. If one of these companies comes and tells you that they want to invest in you, do you take that money? If not, it's very likely they'll take the money to your competitor. So it's almost like you're being dealt with an offer that you can't refuse. And so everything, covering every company in China, ultimately it always leads back to these two companies.
It's interesting because you had a piece about Masayoshi-san, and there was a great anecdote of, I think it was like Grab or something, some Southeast Asian ride sharing or food sharing or something. And the CEO is basically like, Masayoshi gave me the ultimatum saying, if you don't take my money, I'm just going to like kill you by investing in your competitor. So, you can definitely play this game on a global as well as a national scale.
Yeah, Masa also has a tendency to tell people that he wants to invest a lot of money and then bomb everyone else out of the water. So he over-invests.
So, Lulu, what do you think are the most interesting and frustrating parts about covering Chinese technology?
I think you have to always be mindful that China, the tech companies that operate in the country, there's always the sword overhanging these companies, right? So for anyone covering them, I think it's very easy to finger point the companies and say, hey, you're censoring content, you're censoring your users, you're monitoring and surveilling your users. That aspect is widely known, and it permeates basically tech life in China on a daily basis. But how do you move the story beyond that? How do you cover these companies by looking at their side of the story, how they deal with the government, how they deal with users? I think that's a more interesting point of view. And also, like, how do these companies navigate themselves in such a rigid regime and still manage to become successful business operations? And to some certain extent, you're looking at how Tencent is actually, even though very quietly, being a global power player, right? How does that happen?
Could you talk a little bit about the domestic Chinese media landscape and maybe recommend some of your favorite Weixin Gongzhonghao?
There's a lot of Chinese tech media outlets right now. I would say the landscape is not, the content quality is not unified, but I don't really have a favorite account that I go to. You just have to follow everything and then use your judgment to filter out what's real and what's not, because there's a lot of rumors going on as well that like half of the time turn out not to be real. There's another thing, I'd just be mindful. I think a lot of these media outlets are also sponsored by companies, even though they mask themselves as neutral platforms. So that's just something that people have to be mindful of as well.
Some folks are better at it than others, but once you see one author writing sort of like 3 or 4 articles saying nice things about one particular company, it's like, come on, guys, like get an agent to like, hook you up with different firms, so it's less transparent. So Lulu, you've been covering Alibaba and Jack Ma for a long time now. You wrote last year in a piece that Jack Ma has showed that an innovative private enterprise could thrive under a communist party regime once hostile and still at times suspicious of ambitious capitalists. To a remarkable degree, his path-breaking success created the model that gave rise to a technology industry that rivals Silicon Valley, propelling a Chinese economy on track to eclipse that of the U.S. Care to expand a little bit on Jack Ma and his legacy?
I think the context of understanding China's internet ascendance is that for years, the government never thought of this sector as a sexy, lucrative sector that the state absolutely needed to dominate and control. They dominated key sectors like energy, communication, and transport. But in the end, the internet sector was the one that was kind of left out. So that's why you had all these companies with very daring entrepreneurs, many of them with Western backgrounds, who went to Silicon Valley to seek venture capital, take that and come back to China and explore the market. Before the government realized what was happening, you already had a generation of entrepreneurs who thought of themselves on par with their Silicon Valley peers. Through the years, as China's tech giants increased their power and also their dominance over Chinese users, I think the government had a reckoning that this was a sector that they needed to take control of. For the past 7 years, or the past decade, I would say, the story of Chinese internet has been the government trying to rein in these companies and take control over them in the sense that not only in terms of content-wise, but also their daily operations. We've seen the stories just over the past few months where government entities, public security agents have been, first of all, this happened a few years ago where public security agents were sent a dispatch to internet companies that were of certain scale to make sure that their operations were in line. And then just a few months ago in Zhejiang province, the government officials were dispatched to companies like Alibaba to make sure that they say this was an effort to help coordinate government initiatives and companies. But actually, I think a lot of people also view it as reining in these company operations and make sure that they stick with whatever the government initiatives are.
I love the idea of these government officials just showing up at Alibaba and expecting to like understand what's happening in these places. But I think just like scaring the daylights out of folks is more the idea.
Yeah, it will be really interesting to see like if we could actually find out how these government officials are coping, whether people are really answering to them within the companies. It's a real, you could say it's an experiment to see if it really works out in the end. But ultimately,
it's also,
I think the government has a lot
of
of leverage over these companies as well.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I guess I love the personal dynamic of, the regulators are probably making like 1/10 of the salary, right? As like these mid-level Ali managers who they're supposed to be reining in. But no, it's tough because, as you said, just like getting at the heart of these stories as a reporter must be really difficult.
It's hard, but it's exciting as well, seeing how they jump through hoops. I mean, the companies jump through hoops and somehow thrive, and also thrive as actually legit businesses and increase their influence, even though they're on a tight leash, is a fascinating story.
My favorite like Chinese tech giant trying to curry favor with the government story is the NetEase founder creating a pig farm as like a healthy product for China, which I just think is great. This like, gaming giant like Blizzard distributor all of a sudden raising these like high quality pigs. So you have written a little bit about the influence of the CCP on these Chinese tech firms. Tencent, it happens, recently organized a Red Tour for all of the CEOs at Bax. So what do you make of this and party committees becoming more and more of a thing within these firms?
I think it was recently the companies within Fujian province or had connections to Fujian that went on a tour, and it was some of the second tier companies that actually went on this. It's not surprising that they're going on these semi-propaganda tours. Although it might seem very surprising to the outside world that these private companies also need to adhere to a party line, but Communist Party has been requesting private companies, to set up party units within their operations for years, many years already. Right now, there seems to be a lot of a dialing up of that effort.
The other thing I've sort of noticed is how Mao and Maoist thought is deployed as like a business strategy thing, sort of like you're quoting Warren Buffett when, Mao says to surround the countryside and then go into the city. This is like an expansion strategy for a Grubhub or whatnot, which I just think is like would make the old man roll over in his grave.
Well, all these companies have government relations department, and I'm sure they will, on a weekly basis, tell the company what their latest directives are, the rules and the initiatives that they should be pushing out within their company division. Though how much that actually, it probably doesn't translate into bottom line figures, but not adhering to them could cause real trouble for companies. The government ultimately does have the say in everything, and as we've seen with Tencent, this $500 billion company last year lost $120 billion of its market cap just because the government decided to halt approving monetization of games. That's the kind of damage that they can cause.
So Elon and Jack Ma recently took the stage together at a big Shanghai internet conference. Is there anything you can glean from this aside from like two sort of wacky thinkers getting on stage? Are there deep lessons about the differences between U.S. and Chinese tech firms that popped up in this conversation?
Key takeaway is they should have brought on a moderator when you have two giant egos, two billionaires talking with each other. I think ultimately it is going to be a match of competition of egos. So there was a lot of I know better going on between these two. I think ultimately, all the messages that they said have been repeated, at least because I cover this sector. I've heard them a zillion times before, and Elon stuck with his message that he really cares about us becoming a cross-planetary species, and the unlikely event that, and in his view, a very likely event that something catastrophic is going to happen to our planet. Jack Ma is more, I want to stay on Earth, so let's see how we can use AI to create more jobs and make people live happier kind of person. They did agree on one thing, which is that they both think that we're going to go into a population crisis, which they think that people aren't having enough babies. So that was the one thing that they agreed on.
So moving into Ali's present and future, you recently had an interview with Daniel Zhang back in September, who revealed to you that he was a huge Rockets fan. The fact that he has his job still is a real open question there. So assuming the guy gets to keep his job after admitting to Western press his basketball affiliation, could you talk a little bit first about his background within Ali?
Let me not jinx it, but I'm pretty sure that he's going to keep his job. And the reason is, Daniel was not the first successor to Jack Ma. He wasn't the first guy they picked to succeed Jack Ma. There was Jonathan Liu before him. The situation within Ali is very complex in the sense that, you have these founding partners and then a partnership committee of 30 people. So a lot of old hands in the company who view themselves as, we built this thing, right? First of all, you need to understand the company culture, the mentality, and also earn the respect of these people. And after the interviews that we did, I'm pretty sure that Daniel has done that part of his job. Now, the second part of the question is, what legacy can he build going into the future?
He already has a legacy. He created Shuangshiri. What a genius.
Yes, he created Double 11. He created he was part of the team that helped really build Tmall into the core cash cow it is right now. So that all earned him credit for putting him in this position right now. But if you look at Alibaba, it's still largely an e-commerce company, right? That is the legacy. People will think of that as the legacy of Jack Ma. What Daniel wants to do even further is really combine online retail with offline retail, and I think Hema is his first experiment. Whether it'll be successful remains to be seen.
Let's talk a little bit about this. So Hema, it's this really pleasant supermarket, which also is very sort of efficient at delivery. And if you go into the buildings, you see all these like bags flying across the ceiling, which is a sort of surreal and like sort of stressful experience. But aside from that, is really interesting. So he writes, or you quote him saying that, we started this Hema business and put them in Shanghai. And he said there were two reasons. First, if you can stay away from headquarters, then you can work quietly and try things out yourself. And second is for convenience, because I'm Shanghainese. I come back home every weekend. So I was working here in Hangzhou during the week, and then I spent the weekend with my team here in Shanghai trying to incubate a new baby. And there's been a fair amount of controversy with respect to Alibaba and overtime culture. And, this guy whose family is in Shanghai, I wonder how much time is getting reserved for, hanging out with the wife and kids if he has his giant new baby startup in his weekend home.
Yeah. Daniel is known for sleeping with his eyes open. The Lazada team told us the story as well, along the lines of them having a late night call to discuss a key initiative, and they had a bet to see how fast it would take or how long it would take for Daniel to respond back. And they messaged him on Ding Talk, and within 30 seconds the phone was ringing. So this guy has 30 direct reporting lines, which according to you go to any MBA class and they teach you about management, they'll tell you that's way too many direct reporting lines. But that's the kind of thing that he's facing right now. So I don't think Daniel, if Jack Ma says people need to only work 4 hours in the future, that definitely does not apply to him. What was your question, earlier question again?
Oh, I don't know if there was a question. I like the other thing about you write about how he's this like super sort of short, unassuming, not particularly charming guy was mistaken as a janitor. I mean, maybe this is like the real key. All these like Bao Dao Zong Cai, like super like tall, handsome, commanding people didn't get the cut because perhaps Jack wanted to see like another version of himself at the helm. Like if you're too handsome, you just like can't do a good job running a giant tech firm, I guess.
Well, there's a lot of smart people working for Jack Ma, and having a huge ego probably doesn't really play into your advantage, right? I think part of being a charismatic leader is letting other people feel smart while directing them in the right way.
So could you talk a little bit about Daniel's new initiatives for the future of Alibaba?
Right now, Daniel is very focused on his new retail initiative, and that starts with Hema. Hema is a pretty capital-intensive business. There's a lot of skepticism around this unit. Investors are questioning why they're shifting away from the asset-light model into a much more asset-heavy, capital-intensive business operation. But for Daniel, I think it goes back to his thought and philosophy in the sense that he doesn't think that when any business can last forever, no business is evergreen. So instead of waiting for other companies to come and disrupt Alibaba's business, he'd rather come up with new initiatives and kill off his own company by disrupting within. He thinks that within the future, online business is still a very limited segment of commerce. The entire commerce sector in China is a $4 trillion business. So if you can capture that part of the puzzle and use technology to upgrade and digitalize that part of the business, then they probably have a head start or a bigger chance of sustaining as a longer business.
So you also had a really fun portrait of Meituan CEO Wang Xing, which has a very tortured history with Alibaba, of course. Maybe talk a little bit about their past and the sort of resentment that this guy Wang Xing still holds for Ali and Jack Ma.
Yeah, Wang Xing is the rebellion because he started out his business by pledging allegiance to Jack Ma, to the Alibaba camp. But midway through, the person switched camps and decided to align himself with Alibaba's arch rival, Tencent. Until today, I think this has left a bad taste in the Alibaba management, and the animosity still exists. In our interview with Wang Xing, we found him as a very outspoken person. He's very thoughtful, logical. He doesn't hold back on words, definitely. So I think when the piece came out, some of the stuff he said also sparked a lot of reaction and controversy as well.
My favorite part was he called Facebook Incorporated a copycat for imitating online services. But the guy did a pixel by pixel copy of both Facebook and Twitter. The gall. I love this.
Yeah, I think like Wang Xing, he explained his philosophy about how to create products with us. He doesn't think that copycatting is a sin. He thinks that like whoever creates a product, and it goes back to the whole issue of copyrights in China. It's always been well, in the old days, copyrights was never tightly monitored, and copyright infringement was a huge issue in the country. So in a landscape like this, where everyone is copying everyone, the winners who ultimately take the dominant share of the market were the ones who were creating micro-innovation, designing the products better for users that they became so intuitive to use. Wang Xing doesn't deny the fact that his first two products, including Fanfao, were copycats of Twitter, for example. But I think his point was even more that Facebook is now doing the same exact thing, that it's copying a lot of competitors, including some of the features from its Chinese competitors as well. But people aren't talking about it. That's why he decided to raise the issue.
Oh, okay, so it wasn't necessarily a dig at Facebook as much as a, hey guys, stop picking on me for doing this. Like, this is just how technology works now.
Yeah. I think that the latter was more what he was getting at.
So the other bombs he was throwing out, talking about and returning back to the fact that Alibaba has an integrity problem, besmirching the good name of Chinese business by this sort of like financial transaction which took place back in 2011 that no one really cares that much about anymore. But the man certainly knows how to hold a grudge.
Yes, that happened a very long time ago. It was super controversial at the time. In fact, even today, I think when people ask about Ant Financial, they look at the business, they always look at the history and how it came about, and the dispute between Jack Ma and Yahoo and how he spun Alipay out of the company is always something that people would be looking at. Wang Xing's point was that he thinks this has done damage to Chinese companies as a whole, because foreign investors will always in the back of their minds have this question of whether something like this will happen again.
Sure. Talk a little bit about the delivery war going on now between Meituan and Ele.me.
That is still a cash-burning battle. Right now for 2 quarters, we've seen Meituan increase their share of the delivery market. I think Alibaba still doesn't want to give up. When we talked to Daniel Zhang, they said they're still in it for the long run. They see it as an essential part of their business, where when you're doing food delivery, you can also deliver other products from retail stores, from your convenience store shops. So it ties into their payments business as well. Wang Xing, on the other hand, this is his bread and butter business. So I think it's a long-term battle, and it'll be very interesting to see how it plays out.
I want to say, just to support the little guy, I've gone full in on Meituan. I don't order from Ele.me anymore. It's so interesting because it's a rivalry that it like plays out so directly in the it's not like some abstract battle for like cloud market share or whatnot. Like, you see the people walking around and they have like either an orange or like a yellow shirt on or a blue shirt on. It's very like early days Uber Lyft vibe. Though I don't think there's like or at least to my knowledge, like I haven't found like a cultural contrast in the Meituan as opposed to the Olema delivery people. They always just like run away from me as fast as they can once they give me the food.
I hear they also switch jackets because they service everyone. It's all about the orders that they can get.
Oh, sure. Yeah, no one's walking around with two phones though on their little bikes. I guess you just switch from app to app. Mm-hmm. So, lastly, you care to tell a little bit about the story of Transsion, which is this company that's almost unknown in the West, but has been incredibly successful in selling like low priced phones, particularly to Africa.
Yeah, Transsion is the Chinese phone giant that nobody in China's ever heard of because they essentially started their business in Africa. We interviewed the first member who started their business in Ethiopia, and this guy was literally slapping phones together with 4 other colleagues in this bungalow in the capital near the president headquarters, like 20 minutes away, like in this bungalow. And from there, they managed to include these micro innovations, for example, dual or multiple SIM cards, because in the country there are multiple telecom operators, and when you do cross telecom operator calls, it's very expensive. They also tweaked the camera so that it would help take better photos for people with darker skin. So little micro innovations like that made them really popular in the local market. Of course, there was also the pricing war. Their prices were very competitive compared with any other smartphone. They started out with the dummy phones, but then gradually moved into smartphones. But for whatever type of phones they were producing, their prices were very competitive on the market. So right now you have this company essentially taking over the majority of the African market and moving into India and going head to head with companies like Xiaomi, Samsung, and it's amazing that people in China don't realize that there's this giant that is in China right now that you could say is a Chinese company, but just, most people don't know about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think for all the sort of negative attention over the past weeks, that's rightly been pointed at Chinese tech firms' international expansion. I mean, this is like a really happy story, right? Of folks who wouldn't have gotten phones because the Apples and Samsungs in the world don't care enough, and the sort of like the amount of potential profit is too small. But a Chinese firm that has this sort of engineering expertise is able to put it towards a use and serve a market that wouldn't otherwise be served. So it's nice to think of these sorts of things just with all the sort of negative stuff you've seen in the press over the past few weeks.
Yes, but they've also run into their fair share of controversy. For example, the locals. This company gets a lot of criticism as well from locals who say that they only deal directly with the parties in power. They hire too many Chinese people, import them from China, and don't hire enough locals. I think that's all issues that any Chinese company has to deal with in their course of expansion globally. The mindset of only dealing with the government definitely comes from operating within China. You only have one regime that you need to answer to, whereas, for example, in Ethiopia, their whole operation had to come to a standstill, partly because of domestic turmoil, the rivaling opposition trying to take over power within the country.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. You do have a quote in there about how Chinese firms don't really engage with opposition parties because it's just not in the mind space. Like, it doesn't make sense. I just learned the word Zaiyaman, and it's like the word for opposition party in Chinese is like the barbarian, like the out in the wilderness party, which is just why would you hang out with the people who are riding around in like the steppes of Inner Mongolia or whatnot? But in democracy is like sometimes they win elections, right? And it's very typical, I think, of this story. Lulu, thanks so much for coming on China Econ Talk. It was a pleasure.
My pleasure too. Thank you.
China Econ Talk is edited by Jason McRonald and Kaiser Guo and is a proud member of the Sinica Network from SUP China. For other great shows on China, check out the Caixin Sinica Business Brief, the Pan Daily Tech Buzz China, the New Voices Podcast, and of course, the Sinica Podcast, now in its 9th year. Until next week.
Look at me， 从上到下，就哪怕小的细节也要美到爆炸。带上有钱，节奏抬头脚下，嫉妒的也只能在网上叫骂。新一代女王出现，快点都给我让开！我从来不带眼看他们设下的障碍，一换来换去怎么办？一选择头疼，这里好心情，在台下油门，女王的心意，耀眼的星星，时尚的精英，搭配什么看我的心情。